Okay, welcome. For people who don't know me, I'm Brian Trotier. I'm the program chair for the Rhode Island Democratic Club. We are pleased to present a program tonight on all the things that are on the ballot. Generally speaking, those are some of the most confusing items. And I think, as Mike, being a lawyer, will tell you, that's intentionally done in terms of the way they word their issues, so that sometimes yes means no, and no means yes, up means down, and down means up. And I guess it was Alice in Wonderland for looking glass. Anyway, we have Susan Baxter from the League of Women Voters with us. She is going to do a presentation on the ballot measures that are on the ballot for November 8th here in California. Susan, I will turn it over to you. And, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Brian. So Brian said that you were interested in particularly spending some time on the two propositions about gambling. And so I'll go fast, and then we'll slow down on those, and I'll go fast afterwards. Theoretically, we should be able to make it all the way through the ballot in about an hour. I don't know how you wanted to ask questions. I forgot to ask you that, Brian. But feel free to speak up, and I'm sure he'll moderate if needed to get off track. So the League of Women Voters, I'm a representative of the League of Women Voters of San Diego. And we were founded when women got the right to vote, so over 100 years ago now. And the thing that's important for tonight is that we're a nonpartisan organization. We do not take stands for or against candidates or political parties, but we are activists. We will advocate for propositions or measures that are somehow related to our mission of voting rights and equality. So there are two tonight that are signed on as supporters. I'll make sure to point those out. The main thing is, I know that you're recording this evening, but you can also go to the League of Women Voters San Diego website. We have all sorts of tools right now. The election info box is right smack in the middle of the screen, not off to the side like this. It's bigger and more obvious. You can click on that to find information about the candidates and the measures coming up. We also always have the voter service pull down and how to make ballot choices. So a lot of the things I'm going to say tonight verbally, you can go there and read again at the website. So feel free to take advantage of that. The other thing that we emphasize, I put some of these on the back table also, advertising the Voter's Edge. It's a publication that we help put together. It's also online. You can use that as a resource as you're trying to figure out your stand-up measures ballots. The Easy Voter Guide is a good one to look up. And again, you can find these links to these kind of publications at the League of Women Voters website as well. So what we do in the League is we get together and we go through a process of analyzing all the measures and propositions that's on this slide. What does it do? How does it change existing law? Who benefits? Who's paying for it? And essentially what I'm going to do tonight is walk you through this logic for each propositions and measures. Like I said, some of them will go a lot faster through, some of them will slow down and go point by point here. And again, if I'm going too fast or too slow, please raise your hand and ask questions. So I need to also say that we always present to you the information that we get from the official voters guide and also information from the legislative analyst's office. And so the information that I'm going to be presenting tonight is from those publications, and a lot of the verbiage on why you should vote or why you should vote against something comes from the supporters or the opponents to each measure. And I'm going to actually have to read some of them to make sure I represent their opinions clearly and correctly, but I myself or the League of Women Voters can't vouch for their accuracy because these are statements submitted by the supporters, the opponents to each of the measures. So I'll try not to let my opinion show. I'll try to be just a presenter of the information that we have in hand, same as what you'll have in hand. And again, it all comes back to you. What do you think about each measure individually once you weigh the support and the opposition arguments? So California state ballots on the books this year are three kinds of things. They make new laws, they change existing laws, or they change the California Constitution. We sort of have all three flavors on the ballot this month. They're placed on the ballot by collecting enough voter signatures or put on the ballot by the state legislature. All of them in this election upcoming are solved by majority vote. So all require a simple majority to pass. So 50% plus one vote will pass any of the measures or propositions on the ballot. So we have these propositions to go through, and we were talking earlier, it's the lowest annual number of propositions to appear on California ballots since 1960. Brian was saying, but they're getting more confusing, so it feels like a lot. But these are the ones we'll roll through tonight. So first, to kind of get you used to how to analyze the propositions the way the league does, we're going to start at the top with Proposition 1, which is a proposition changing the constitutional rights in the state constitution to give the constitutional right to reproductive freedom. It was placed on the ballot by the legislature, and it needs a simple majority to pass. So the context here is you're likely familiar with this federal Supreme Court case, Roe versus Wade, which was decided in 1973. It recognized and protected the right to choose an abortion in the United States Constitution. Since then, states and Congress have enacted legislation or laws to define or limit that right, which is typical. Throughout the years, the right to choose an abortion was upheld by the Supreme Court, even as limits were placed on it in different states and jurisdictions. However, in June this year, the Supreme Court announced its decision in the Dobbs versus Jackson case, striking down the holding in Roe, eliminating federal protection for this right to an abortion. So California law right now is similar, is it has things on the books that allow people to choose to have an abortion and that they have privacy about making that choice. But these rights are not specifically named in the California Constitution. So Prop 1 would change the Constitution to enshrine the current law regarding reproductive health care. And specifically, the statute would say the state shall not deny or interfere with an individual's reproductive freedom in their most intimate decisions, which includes their fundamental right to choose to have an abortion and their fundamental right to choose or refuse contraceptives. Looking at the fiscal bottom line of this one, there are no anticipated impacts on the state budget beyond the cost needed to place it on the ballot. Signs of the official arguments are listed throughout the presentation in bold. That means that when you go to the official voters guide, they will be listed as supporters or opponents later of the measure. And like I alluded to earlier, the League of Women Voters in California has signed on to Proposition 1 in support of this one, along with the California Medical Association and others you can see here. To date, about 11 or almost $12 million has been raised in support of this measure. So in opposition, ranges from the California Catholic Conference, but individual assembly people also have signed on officially to in opposition of this measure. The current amount raised in opposition is about $128,000 to date. So Proposition 1, a yes vote means that you favor amending the California Constitution to guarantee reproductive rights, including contraception and abortion. And a no vote means you do not agree that guaranteeing reproductive rights should be part of the California Constitution. Pause very quickly for any questions or clarifications. Otherwise, I'll just keep going. Go on, okay. All right, the next two propositions have to do with gambling. And I'll try to go more slowly on this and read you some more about from the opposition and support arguments on this one. The first one is Proposition 26. It allows in-person roulette, dice games, sports wagering on tribal lands. It's a constitutional amendment put on the ballot by initiative. Okay. So currently, the California Constitution limits gambling in California. The state law specifically bans, or the laws itself ban sports betting, roulette, and games with dice. But it allows tribal casinos that have a compact with the state to offer lottery, card rooms, and horse racing. And then, of course, we have the Del Mar horse racing track here in California. There are 4 licensed horse racing tracks in California as well. California currently has compacts with many different tribes all over the state, but none can do roulette, sports betting, games with dice. So the context here is that the Supreme Court in 2018 struck down a federal law banning sports betting in particular. So since then, about 35 states across the country have allowed some form of sports betting. So sports betting in particular is betting on the outcome of a sports game. Not even necessarily whether a team wins or loses, but you could bet on what the Padres are going to do in the 3rd inning, and how many runs they might score. All of that falls under sports betting. It can also be betting on things like award shows, the way this law is written. So who's going to win an Emmy is considered under sports betting as well. So sports betting in general then is currently illegal in California with the exception of horse racing. So we're sort of familiar with that in San Diego. And basically the compact with the tribes requires that funds are used to send money to tribes that do not operate casinos and to cover regulatory costs of states. So the way it is right now, there's some money that's set aside for tribes that do not have compacts with the state. So the revenues that come in from gambling are then sent and distributed with other tribes. All right, that's context. Proposition 26 would allow in-person roulette, dice games, and sports wagering on tribal lands and the 4 horse racing tracks that are licensed already. The age limit for gambling, the tribe can choose whether it's 18 or 21 in Proposition 26. And then people going to the horse racing track would have to be 21 to bet in these new ways. Okay, the fiscal bottom line is difficult to predict. The legislative analyst says that they foresee that there would be increased state revenues, possibly reaching the tens of millions of dollars level annually. But there would also be a shift from other ways that people spend money. And the example used most commonly in editorials today has been you might spend less on cigarettes, which are also taxed. If you buy less cigarettes, like fewer taxes on cigarettes and more taxes on gambling. But it's impossible to predict what people will individually do and how that will add up annually. This proposition, the revenues that are left after deducting the costs of regulating this new law, 70% would be sent to the state general fund for California. 15% would go to programs dealing with gambling, and 15% would go to the Department of Justice to enforce the new gaming laws. So general fund, programs dealing with gaming and mental health research associated with gaming, and then 15% to the Department of Justice to enforce the laws. So in support, supporters have raised almost $112 million at this point. That's incredible amount of money going into this proposition and the next one. You can see there on the slide, there's a series of tribes in bold that have signed on in support of this proposition. Also, the NAACP has been in support, and the Lieutenant Governor and the State Treasurer have supported this. The arguments here are that this proposition would expand sports betting in the state of California in a responsible way because it limits wagering to adults only. They argue that it supports Indian self-reliance by providing revenue to the tribes. It promotes safe and responsible gaming and helps stop and prevent illegal gambling because it has to be done in person, is their point. And they say it's the most responsible approach to authorizing sports wagering. In opposition, the National Veterans Foundation signed on in opposition, but several other chambers of commerce across the state have also been verbal in their opposition to the proposition. Their argument is that it's a massive expansion of gambling that will lead to more underage gambling and addiction. It is sponsored by 5 wealthy tribes who want to expand the monopoly on gambling to include sports betting. It still doesn't do enough to protect casino workers on worker safety points, wage and hour harassment, and anti-discrimination laws. And it will increase the popularity of horse racing, they say, leading to more horses being mistreated. And they have raised $42.5 million in opposition to this measure. So a yes vote on Proposition 26 means that tribal casinos and racetracks could offer in-person sports betting and some new dice games and casinos. New ways to seek enforcement of certain gambling laws will be put into the measure and administered by the Department of Justice in California. A no vote means the sports betting would continue to be illegal in California. Casinos would continue to be unable to offer the dice games, and no changes would be made to the Department of Justice and how the laws would be enforced. So I promise you, I do have a slide comparing the two propositions at the very end, so we'll come back a little bit to Proposition 26.
This is the first I've heard that they reserve the right to lower the age to 18 now. That's very disturbing.
On the tribal lands only.
Yeah, I've been in that off and on.
Okay. So Proposition 27 is the second of the two gambling propositions. It allows online and mobile sports wagering outside tribal lands in California. So it's also a constitutional amendment. Remember, because right now we say that there can't be sports betting in the Constitution, so it's a constitutional amendment. Okay, this one was brought to the ballot by an organization called Californians for Solutions to Homelessness and Mental Health Support. It's backed by 3 large, that organization is backed by BetMGM and the owners of FanDuel Sportsbook and DraftKings, which are national sports betting organizations that operate across the United States. So again, this context is that the Supreme Court has opened up this change, and so we're all state by state by state considering these changes. Let's see. So it's been very, very lucrative, and that's one reason this particular ballot's on the books this time, because the sports betting companies that have set up operations in other states are very interested, of course, to expanding into California. The lack of legal sports betting, however, doesn't mean that Californians don't engage in it. Of course, the companies can see that. They can see who's gambling, whether they're betting through bookies or offshore companies. And so we shouldn't think that Californians aren't already doing some form of sports betting. And then sports betting does not include, does not prohibit fantasy teams. So if any of you have fantasy sports betting children or grandparents, this law does not actually cover that either. So Proposition 27 allows tribes or gambling companies to offer online sports betting in California. Some of the proceeds would go to combat homelessness for smaller tribes that don't have online gambling or sports betting at all. The difference mainly here between 27 and 26 is that 26 requires in-person betting. This one allows online or mobile on your cell phone betting. Again, the legislative analysts, it's hard to predict what's going to happen. We know already that some Californians are doing sports betting using offshore companies, but we have no way of using that to predict how many people would start betting. But Proposition 27, the way it's written, would impact both state and local revenues and costs. So the actual part is unknown, and it will depend on how it's actually implemented once the proposition is added to, if it's voted in as a constitutional amendment. So certainly would increase state revenues, and it would also increase state regulatory costs, because this proposition requires a whole new entity to be formed at the state level, a trust that would oversee, would be called the California Online Sports Betting Trust Fund. And that has to be actually set up to run in the state of California. And again, the argument is money spent on gambling might not spend on other things that have tax revenues, and so it's difficult to decide. So this one, the way this works is the licensed operators, whether they're a tribal casino or whether they're a nationwide betting organization, the nationwide companies would have to partner with a tribe in California that has a compact with the state of California. And they would have to pay millions of dollars to gain a license to have online betting. So what we do know about fiscal impact is that those licensing fees would come into the state of California. But then the funds, the revenues made from sports betting, 10% after the state regulatory costs are paid would come into the state. So 10%, 90% would go to the companies and tribes. The remaining 10% would be split, with 15% of those revenues going to tribes not involved in online sports betting, California, and 85% would go to homelessness programs and gambling addiction programs. Okay, so 10% would come to the state would take out what it costs to regulate and enforce the law, and then what's remaining from that would go to the other tribes and the homelessness and mental health. So the Legislative Analyst's Office finds unlikely that the increase in state revenues from this proposition would exceed $500 million annually. And their math is largely built on those licensing fees, because we just can't predict behavior. Okay. So in support, supporters have raised over $169 million today. Supporters include tribes that are local here in San Diego. They also include Major League Baseball and other people like the Bay Area Community Services and mayors around the state of California. They argue that Prop 27 requires the use of state-of-the-art technology to ensure that minors do not place bets. It includes substantial fines for violators and bans betting on youth sports, and in particular, you're not allowed to bet on California college sports or high school sports is actually written in the proposition language. It requires strict auditing of the use of the money, and that this new trust fund is going to be set up at the state level. And they argue that Prop 27 requires that 15% of all tax revenue goes to disadvantaged non-gaming tribes. In opposition, it's a eclectic mix of the California Democratic Party and the California Republican Party. It includes Salvation Army of San Bernardino signing on in opposition, and some local tribal alliances. Sorry for the slide transport there. The amount raised in opposition to this is a whopping $228 million today. The arguments against 27 are that online sports betting will not generate jobs or create investment in the state, because the sports betting operations will retain most of the profits. They also say that allowing promotional offers, one of the specified expenses deducted prior to calculating the state's 10%, will be deducted from the gross revenue and will reduce the revenue coming to the state. So there are some carve-outs that don't get counted in the revenue equation. The opposition argues that it will allow online bets to be placed with a credit card, putting problem gamblers at risk of easily incurring large amounts of debt quickly. And they also note that the National Council on Problem Gambling found that online gambling is far more addictive than in-person gambling, and gamblers are 5 times more likely to develop a problem with online gambling. And there are other arguments I'll let you all read when you go home. So if you vote yes on Proposition 27, it means that you're agreeing that licensed tribes or gambling companies could offer online sports betting over the internet and mobile devices to people 21 and older on non-tribal lands in California. Some of the revenue would support small tribes and alleviate homelessness. A no vote means that sports betting would continue to be illegal in California and no changes would be made to how gambling laws are regulated or enforced in California. All right, what's the difference? So Prop 26, sports betting would happen in person if you go to a casino or the 4 licensed racetracks. It would allow for roulette, craps, and other dice games in casinos, and it's largely backed by Native American tribes in California. Proposition 27 legalizes sports betting online. You don't have to go in person to any casino or racetrack. It allows out-of-state gaming companies to partner with Native American tribes in California who may not have casinos, and some revenues go to alleviating homelessness. So the only other note I would make is there's confusion also. What if both are voted in or both voted out? And at this point, we don't know. It would have to be litigated and figured out at the state level. But
Online, how does a casino tell that the bettor is 21? Does it say they're 21? Does somebody check an ID?
I'm not an expert. I have not online gambled myself, but a lot of times you have to certify that you're 21 to get into this site. All I can say is that the 35 other states have figured it out to their satisfaction, and there are new methods being put into place across the nation to try to make that possible. Any other questions? Do you feel like you've been seeped in the details enough? I skipped over some. There's still more you can read about, but I think these are the highlights. Hopefully that helped. All right, Proposition 28. Things get a little bit easier now. This one provides additional funding for arts and music education in public schools in California. It's an initiative put on the ballot through the signature gathering process. It requires, the context here is Proposition 98, of course. Proposition 98 set aside 40% of the revenues to fund public schools. And in that law, it actually requires arts and music education, but there's no specific set aside for that in the law. So there's no guaranteed source of annual funding in the state budget for K through 12 arts and music education in particular. I'm not going to go into the gory details of the context here. I think that this one's a little bit easier to follow. So Proposition 28 would take a formula every year and move it over and say this is marked for arts and music education. And it'll be the amount equal to at least 1% of the total Prop 98 funding received by the schools the prior year. Okay, so another way to say that is that it's less than 1/2 of 1% of the state's total general fund would be set aside for arts and music education. So the passage of the proposition would not increase taxes, and funding would come from existing general fund revenue sources and moved over to this particular item. In support, the organization Californians for Arts and Music in Public Schools was the organization that collected the signatures to be on the ballot. In support, they've raised almost $11 million. The California Teachers Association and the California State PTA are in support, as is the California Democratic Party. They argue that Prop 28 would increase funding for educational programs without raising taxes for Californians. They note that only 1 in 5 California public schools has a dedicated teacher for arts or music programming. And arts and music education can improve students' personal and academic life as they're exposed to it during their education. In opposition, there is no organized opposition to this proposition, very un-Californian tradition. But since it's been on the ballot, there are people writing in editorials to the paper, and so some of them say that they're against Prop 28 because it could limit the state funds available for other spend. So it's earmarking it. And it reduces the flexibility in using the general fund, given whatever California may face from wildfires to downturns in the economy. The LA Times calls this ballot box budgeting, quote unquote. And so that reduces the ability to fund other programs that may be equally important. Question.
I also read where new money would be disproportionately reserved for schools with many low-income students,
Correct.
which makes me want to vote for it, because I think there's so many schools that don't have funds for art.
Right. The supporters put that in saying that they were really trying to make sure that teachers were hired in districts or schools that did not currently have it. And that tended to be lower income economic disadvantaged school districts. All right. So Proposition 28, a yes vote means you approve of the proposed statute to provide additional funding. A no vote means you prefer funding for arts education and public schools continue to depend on state and local budget decisions. How am I doing? Okay.
So does anybody know how much is spent on music right now?
I haven't seen that number. I'm sorry. Don't have that. If that's good Googling might help, but I don't. Good one though. All right, and the microphone's working okay? Okay, all right. All right, Proposition 29 is the next. This one requires an on-site licensed medical professional at kidney dialysis clinics and establishes other state requirements about reporting and regulatory oversight of kidney dialysis clinics. This is an initiative put forward by the Service Employees International Union, United Healthcare Workers West. And you've probably seen it before. This is the third time a proposition on this subject has been on the ballot in the last 5 years. The previous two propositions were voted down both times. This one is largely almost identical to the one that was on in 2020. The difference being is that this allows non-physicians to serve in the on-site staff position that this proposition creates at dialysis clinics. So previously, the proposition had made the case that dialysis clinics need to have an administrative staffer on site to make sure that safety protocols are followed and reported upon, and that kind of reporting would be transparent. So it's not a physician patient-facing role; it's an administrative role at the kidney dialysis clinics. This Proposition 29 differed by saying, okay, there's a physician shortage. We acknowledge that. Instead, we want to allow non-physicians as on-site staff are required by this law. So it can be a nurse practitioner, it could be a staffer who had worked at a dialysis clinic for more than 6 months. So again, it's an administrative role. It's not necessarily a medical oversight role. The American Medical Association in California estimated that the work of this is about the work of 1/4 of a physician's time to do the work that this proposition would take on. And this one also allows for telehealth and alternatives if they couldn't find a person to fill the staffing. So one note I have is that if it really requires only 1/4 of a doctor, maybe they're thinking the doctor could go to 4 different clinics and fulfill this role. So the bottom line, tens of millions of dollars a year annually, likely offset by increasing the clinic's annual license fee in California. So currently, safety regulations at dialysis clinics are overseen by the federal government because overwhelmingly the federal government, Medicare, Medicaid, pays for dialysis. If you have private insurance, your private insurance has to pay for your dialysis for the first 30 months, and then you switch over to federal support healthcare. So feds have a vested interest in regulating this industry very closely. That's who's paying for it largely. And so safety and reporting go through the CDC, and then Medicare, Medicaid oversees the regulatory framework. California follows all of the federal regulations right now. This proposition would change that, set up a California oversight in the California Department of Health and a regulatory framework in California that would be parallel to the existing federal one. So there would be increased costs setting that structure up, the website, things like that. As far as the cost to patients, the thought is that the companies and the hospitals and physicians offering dialysis would go to the state or Medicare and renegotiate their rates to be higher to be able to get more money for each dialysis unit delivered. No way of exactly knowing how that would all play out, of course, it's prediction, not facts, but the analysis is that it might affect low tens of millions of dollars annually in healthcare costs alone. So in support of this are a series of dialysis patients and patient advocates, in addition to the union that put it on the ballot. They raised about $8.2 million in support. They argue that requiring a physician, a nurse practitioner, or a physician assistant to be present during a dangerous procedure like dialysis is common sense and is a matter of public safety. They argue that dialysis clinics may use telemedicine for up to a year if the workers are not available. And they argue that big corporations operating dialysis clinics can easily make the required staffing changes to still profit hundreds of millions of dollars a year. In opposition, they raised $86 million. A lot of the official signers on in opposition are dialysis patients again, but also the California Medical Association and American Nurses Association based in California. They argue that dialysis is administered by specially trained technicians, and every dialysis patient is already under the care of their own kidney doctor. So extra administrative oversight is unnecessary. They argue that Prop 29 would worsen the healthcare worker shortage, taking thousands of these individuals from hospitals where they're needed and placing them in an administrative job. They argue that the unnecessary requirement for on-site patient administrators who do not provide patient care would cost hundreds of millions of dollars every year, forcing clinics to perhaps reduce hours or close. And then they argue lastly that new regulations introduced by Proposition 29 are redundant. Most issues addressed in the proposed law are addressed already by federal regulations. So Proposition 29, a yes vote means that you agree that the chronic dialysis centers would need to increase staffing and their reporting to the state of California Department of Health. A no vote means things would remain as they are, and California will primarily rely on federal regulations as far as how they operate dialysis in the state and how they license and take reporting from. 2 hands raised.
Well, has there been a history of problems with dialysis?
I'm not an expert on this, and you can go to the CDC website to see reported issues with the different clinics across the state. So you can actually dig through that data. It is available on the federal website. I do think that medically, there are about 80,000 patients in California alone who go through chronic dialysis clinics, and a lot of them are in-stage life. So it is a very difficult and highly technical procedure that needs to be monitored by doctors. So not a simple procedure, it's common. Another question?
Since the union is bringing this back a third time, how do they think this is going to help them unionize those 2 large clinics?
So all I can report back to you is what I've read in the paper, and the union president himself said that they're doing this to raise awareness about healthcare issues in the state of California.
Yes. So, carrying it.
Another question?
Yeah, more of a comment. I haven't heard or read anything in the papers about any scandals of, people, having problems at these kidney dialysis centers. And I don't know if everyone's aware of this, but Medicare covers people with end-stage renal failure regardless of their age. So that's probably why it's mainly federally regulated, because in almost all cases, Medicare is paying for this dialysis. And, you know, I'm pro-union, but I think that the SEIU, I mean, they're doing something funny here, because this is their third try and they've been soundly defeated 2 times before.
Right, I think the only thing that I've seen is nothing healthcare wise, but the problem with some of these larger clinic operators have had has been fraud during the billing process. But that's also the Medicare issue in general with the whole healthcare system.
Yeah,
So I don't know why the state regulator would add anything.
yeah, they probably wouldn't, because it's all federal, because it's really being billed to Medicare.
Okay, I don't know if the Zoom people would hear that, but there's a little bit of debate. Summing up mainly that, that Medicare and federal sources oversee this process, and that any problems with dialysis would be regulated at the federal level. That's some of the extent. Okay, Proposition 30. This proposition is a citizens initiative as well. It provides funding for programs to reduce air pollution and prevent wildfires by increasing tax on personal income for people or families that make over $2 million a year. So context, we all know that state law now requires California to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions to 40% of what we're doing now, so 1990 levels, and we need to get it done by 2030. State law also requires that ride-sharing companies like Lyft and Uber have 90% of their drivers using zero-emission vehicles by 2030. So the ZEVs will be used on these slides, the zero-emission vehicles. And then in August, we also said that 35% of new cars sold in California should be electric by 2035. So we've got a lot of work to do. And this proposition was put on the ballot in hopes that it could help. So Proposition 30 would tax income over 20 million. It also would not only fund the ZEVs, but also wildfire suppression, which has a lot to do with our increasing pollution and decreasing air quality in California, as we all know. And interestingly, the proposition wrote in that the tax increase would end on 2043 or earlier if the goals are met for the greenhouse gas emissions. So the funds, as the proposition is written, would be allocated. 45% of the funds would promote the purchase of ZEVs, including subsidies and rebates for passenger cars and medium and heavy duty vehicles like trucks. So all would be included. 35% of the funds would increase the availability of the ZEV infrastructure like charging stations. And 20% would help wildfire suppression and prevention, with the stipulation that the funds would be used to hire firefighters and provide additional training. And in particular, the funds about the infrastructure, they also were targeting low-income or economically disadvantaged neighborhoods to make sure that infrastructure was put in those neighborhoods. The fiscal bottom line is that it would generate between $3.5 to $5 billion in revenue most years, probably increasing over time. That means that about $700 million to $1 billion annually would go to wildfire response, for instance. And the measure could help decrease the monies that local and state governments would have to put into wildfire fighting and or infrastructure for electric cars. So in support, it's a lot of people signed on from the Natural Resources Defense Council to the Union of Concerned Scientists and the American Lung Association. They've raised about $47 million in support of the issue. And I will say that as of tonight, Lyft, the company, has contributed $45 million of that support.
What we put Lyft.
So they, Lyft was not involved in bringing the proposition forward originally. You see, they're not in bold here, but they've obviously supported the issue.
They could be giving that money to Alex Jones.
So they argue that Proposition 30 will reduce catastrophic wildfires and air pollution from vehicles. And they argue also that it will be taxing only the wealthiest 0.2% of Californians. In opposition, they raised about almost $15 million to date. It includes California Small Business Association. The governor is against the Proposition 30, as is, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't read before, as is the California Republican Party and the Teachers Association. They argue that Californians are already paying high income taxes and are facing high inflation. And something that was very significant that happened since the proposition was put on the ballot. So when they put it on the ballot, they didn't know that California was going to set aside $50 billion for essentially the same sort of issues around ZEVs and wildfire prevention. In fact, the new spending plan that the governor and the legislature put together had $10 billion for ZEVs alone already set aside. So when this was put on, they didn't know about that. So your decision is whether you want even more to go that way. The opposition argues that you know, we've dealt with this. We have a lot of money going towards these issues. We don't need to do it again. And then they argue that it's Lyft's attempt to help get taxpayers to help put the bill to the requirement to increase the number of CEUs used. But again, money is being set aside for that bigger package as well. Okay, so get up to. So Proposition 30, a vote yes means you favor the increased tax and its targeted revenue for ZEVs and wildfire response. No vote means you prefer the status quo and no change would be made to taxes on personal income to people making $22 million annually. All right. So Proposition 31 is a referendum on a 2020 law that the voters passed that would prohibit the retail sale of flavored or certain flavored tobacco products. A referendum, to remind you, is that in California, when the voters pass a law or it's passed by the legislature, entities and individuals that disagree with the new law have 90 days to file against it, circulate a petition to garner enough signatures to put the referendum on the ballot. In other words, second yes, but just maybe. And that's what's happened here. So this one is largely backed by large tobacco companies. The law was designed to ban the sale of flavored tobacco products and tobacco product flavor enhancers. The law didn't go into effect because of the referendum. I will say that it didn't cover all tobacco products. Premium cigars and hookah tobacco were not included in the previous law in SB 700. Sorry about my stuff. So the fiscal bottom line is that last year we raised about $2 billion in tobacco taxes, and they're used to help fund healthcare and tobacco control efforts. This new law would decrease state tobacco tax revenues because theoretically you're selling fewer flavored tobacco products. In support of the law are American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Heart Association, American California Medical Association, the governor. They've raised about $8.8 million in support of it. They note that more than 2 million middle and high school students now use e-cigarettes. 4 out of 5 kids who use tobacco started with a flavored product. And importantly, SB 793 does not criminalize individuals for using or purchasing flavored tobacco products, but it instead criminalizes the people who sell them in stores. In opposition, I've worn out the advance. Okay, in opposition, chambers of commerce, business federations are against it. They raised about $2 million in opposition. They argue that youth should never have access to any tobacco products. This is to be achieved without imposing a total prohibition on products that millions of adults choose to use. They argued that law is unfair since they've exempted hookah and cigars and some pipe tobacco law. And the prohibition will hurt small local businesses and jobs products that are pushed from the market in California. So a yes vote means that you support the legislation that prohibits stores and vending machines from selling most flavored tobacco products. And no vote means you wish to repeal the legislation and believe that stores and vending machines should be able to sell flavored tobacco products as allowed under current rules. All right, that's it for the state proposition. Do we have time to do this local measures? Do you want to keep rolling?
Well, none of these affect
Keep going.
us.
Yeah, that's the one county-wide. Everything else is city of San Diego. So we could do measure A, and then people who want to learn more about the city of San Diego, they just say, I don't.
Measure A only affects unincorporated areas.
But you get to vote on it.
But we get to vote on it, that's true.
You have
Okay.
20 minutes.
All right, so we're doing okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to use up my 20 minutes trying to advance to the next slide. There we go. Okay. So Measure A is an ordinance establishing a tax on cannabis business activities on the unincorporated area of San Diego County. Currently, there are 5 of these businesses. It was put on the ballot by the County Board of Supervisors. It would create a new tax, and that tax revenue would go for general government purposes in the county. It allows the Board of Supervisors to change that tax too. So the fiscal bottom line is that they think it would generate between $3 to $5 million annually. The cost would be related to hiring some additional staffers to regulate the 5 businesses and perhaps more businesses that would be started. And because they're promising that they may allow more permits in 2024 to get this going. And support are the Board of Supervisors in the county. They argue that it's a bipartisan solution to advance a safe, regulated, and legal market across San Diego County and keeping the tax revenues, keeping the tax revenues to fund parks, libraries, and health and social equity across the county. The tax would be paid solely by the cannabis businesses in the unincorporated area of the county. The tax will not apply in addition to the cannabis businesses in cities, so it won't be a double tax on the city businesses that are already licensed in the county. In opposition are taxpayers associations and some retired administrators and council members and tax fighters in general. They argue that this tax is unfair because it only applies to businesses in unincorporated San Diego County, while the revenue can be used county-wide. And they also argue that it's unfair because it allows people outside the unincorporated area to vote on the issue and weigh in on this. So if you vote yes on Measure A, somehow got some things up there. Okay, there we go. Measure A means that you will allow a new tax on cannabis businesses in unincorporated areas, and no vote means that cannabis businesses would not be taxed in this way. All right, that's all for the Coronado ballot. If you're interested, you can come up and talk to me more, or I can answer questions about things we've already covered. Or throw it back to Brian. So nice to have that.
Thank you, Susan. That was very helpful. Do anybody have any questions? Anything need clarification? Oh.
So control away from. Well, I have a slide with all the good information about the website.
I can't click and talk at the same time. I don't have that kind of skill. Any questions? Any comments? Everybody's happy?
She did it great.
Yeah, fantastic.
The League of Women Voters does this, and they're just great. We had originally wanted them in September, but it turns out they don't start doing this until after all the ballot language is in, and they have a chance to go through and train their staff. So you said you're gonna do 7 of these, and this is your 3rd. So they just got started really in October, putting these out. So we're really lucky that we got her here now when the mail-in ballots just arrived, and I think that was great timing, and it worked out well for everybody.
They've been doing this for over 50 years. in San Diego. When I was running the city council in the 60s, I was doing it.
It's a great group. I'm biased, but it's a great group.
Well, if we don't have any other questions, we'll wrap things up. Thank you very much for being here, and those of you at home.
Anything else about Rachel's for high school?
Yeah, Bill, if you want to come up.
Ask the boss first, Marley.